Okay, I think we're live. We'll wait just a few seconds for a few people to join into the room. But yeah, for now, hello guys, welcome to this webinar session on using benchmark KPIs to validate football player tips. Just a brief outline, we'll have about 20 minutes of a presentation from myself and then 10 minutes at the end for questions. My colleague Yash should put a message in the chat box in a second. Yeah, there he is. So yeah, if you do have any questions, yeah, feel free to put them in the chat box and then we'll get to them at the end. Anything to do with football data and scouting, yeah, nothing's off limits over there. So I think I'll share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, yeah, I think we're good to go. So yeah, thank you all guys for joining. My name's Reece Chambers. I'm one of the football recruitment consultants here at SciSports. And yeah, my role is essentially to help customers, clubs, agencies, and other football organizations to use our products at SciSports most effectively. And something that we do quite a lot with clubs especially is using benchmarks in data to validate football player tips. And that session is obviously very closely related to what we'll do today. As I said, today's session will be a 20-minute webinar. So I'll give a brief overview of the modern day scouting process, some frequently asked questions, and then we'll dive into a use case for identifying positional priorities and setting benchmarks. And that will closely relate to how benchmarks can be used in validating tips. And then there's a chance for you guys at the end for any questions. So we'll have around 10 minutes then. Like I said, if you do have any questions, leave them in the chat box below. So a brief overview of how the football industry is developing right now, or has done over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. I think a lot of you guys here today will know how data analytics has really been on the rise in terms of the recruitment process. And we've seen quite a lot of examples of teams who have developed their data analytics departments really well and really successfully, become a competitive edge in football right to the top level, but also lower down as well. I think there are some really good examples of how teams have used analytics, but I think this visualization gives a good idea of how recruitment has kind of changed or evolved over the last 10 years. So there really has been a focus on live scouting traditionally, going to stadiums, using networks and elements like that. I think video analysis came around maybe 10, 15 years ago now, and has really helped in terms of the global outreach for clubs and scouts to be able to see players on video. And then in the last 5 to 10 years especially, data analytics has risen and become a very popular part of football scouting and a very well-known part as well. And us at SciSports, we're proud to be a part of that. But clubs especially, the way they apply data into their recruitment processes is very interesting. And during the session today, I think we'll give a good overview of how that's used, especially in benchmarking KPIs. So a brief outlook on modern day scouting and how that process looks. I think the funnel on the right-hand side is a good sort of analogy to look at. So football scouting has traditionally been video and live. However, as guys at SciSports, we do a lot of work with data, as you probably know. But that red area there on the right in the funnel gives quite a good idea of how data can be used as a wide catchment area. So what is the data saying about players in all parts of the world? And that can be an initial process for a lot of clubs. That's certainly how we see a lot of clubs moving towards nowadays, is using scouting at the initial stage. SciSports obviously is one supplier of doing that. And then from there, moving on to other elements like video scouting and live scouting, and then getting to the negotiation stage and eventually signing a player. So how do we get from top to bottom? There's a lot in between, which we'll hopefully go through some of that today. But the end goal, of course, is to buy players for not only as cheap as possible, but in the most efficient way as well. And we believe that data scouting can really help in that process. So something to outline, I think, here is the the relationship between clubs and agents. So we're looking at how clubs can validate football player tips. To do that, they will obviously get a lot of tips from agents. So what is the relationship like? Well, the club on a high overview is looking for the best possible fit at the best possible price. So what that means is not only the best possible fit in terms of a tactical point of view and somebody who aligns with what the head coach or manager wants, but also looking at a cultural fit as well. So that can be something that an agent, for example, is very good at being able to help a club with. So if we move on to the agent side of things, they're looking for the best possible move for their player. So that kind of links back to the best possible fit in a way, because we're looking at somebody who can be a successful transfer. How you define a successful transfer is obviously quite subjective, but in total, I think the club and the agent can work in quite a good way together. But it is a very interesting relationship as well, because the club is obviously looking for one main objective on a club's interests, and the agent from the agent side as well. So that's really how the relationship is on a broad level. But I think the main part of today's topic is the fact that clubs are often tipped over 100 times a day from agents on players. So how will a player fit in at that club? That's something that the club needs to know pretty quickly. So using data can be a really good part of being able to validate that sort of tip that comes in from an agent, rather than just relying on the information that maybe the agent has in terms of their opinion on a player or something like that. And as I see there, as I've written there, there's a really clear trend in the market at the moment towards using more data and using a more sophisticated way of this relationship being not only productive but efficient as well. So how is the club able to it's really a good sort of way of being able to look into the market from a data perspective. Is obviously very interesting, but as well, I think the most important thing is that this relationship should be a successful process overall. But in the main, I think there are some challenges as well, which we'll go through today, and hopefully we can illustrate how data can help not only clubs but agents as well. So if we go to the main process of validating tips, what are some frequently asked questions within the scouting process? So I think the most important ones we've outlined here. So skill level, is the player able to adapt to the quality of the league we're playing in from a club perspective? That's obviously a very subjective thing. As I'm going to show in a minute, I think data can be used to provide an indication of that and whether the player is at the required level for the club. But also as well looking at on-field performances as well. So what is the player good at? What are his weaknesses as well? I think strengths and weaknesses are two of the most obvious things in scouting. So everybody has their opinion on a player and what they're good at, maybe what they're not so good at. But overall, data can be, again, a really good way of illustrating how that's an efficient way of checking a player and validating them. But also looking into other things as well, like the physical level and the playing style. And overall, the message is that data can be used in an efficient and objective manner to allow a club to see whether a player reaches their benchmarks. And what we'll go through shortly is a use case to look into how a player can fit within those parameters that a club has. So just briefly, how can we use the SciSports recruitment application to answer some of these frequently asked questions? I've taken the example of Chris Wood at Newcastle to see whether he's a good signing initially from the data point of view for Newcastle. Is there one of their new centre forward options? So related to skill level, this is a screen I've taken from the SciSports recruitment application. So what I'm doing here is comparing his current size skill and his potential, which is the same value due to his age. But we see here that he's a first team player for Newcastle, which in the initial process tells us a good thing that he's of the required level, but also looking into the performance as well. So on the pitch, what is he doing well? What is he doing poorly? We see there that compared to other centre forwards in the Premier League last season, he was in the top third, and he had some high performance traits like pressing, finishing, and ball retention. Within the application, clubs are able to go into more depth on that side of things as well. So what type of finishing is he good at? What type of pressing? and he can be benchmarked, as you see there, the small dots are other players in the Premier League in that season. Physical attributes as well, that's something we've developed quite recently at SciSports, is being able to measure the physical attributes of a player. So here we see Wood is categorized as a slow centre forward with relatively high stamina. From probably most people's opinions, that would be a familiar sort of benchmark for where we would put him. So again, that kind of matches with what we have to say. And then looking at his playing style as well. So answering the tactical fit question, where does he fit in terms of a striker? Last season, he was mainly a target man or a poacher. And given that Newcastle were looking for a focal point up front in the absence of Callum Wilson, sometimes Wood could align well with that playing style. So from all the elements we've looked at there, we would say that Wood, all of these elements are showing all the right signs of Wood being a good signing. But also as well, we need to look into a bit more depth on the sort of benchmarks that we would be setting for the position. So for this, we're going to do a short use case. So we're going to validate tips for a striker. So let's say, a club has told a network of agents that they're looking for a striker. In this case, we're a championship club looking for a striker to help us get promoted to the Premier League. And they need a centre forward who can get them there. So that's generally a player from the top of your head who would be quite expensive, because getting from the Championship to the Premier League is a tough task. However, something that's really important is getting a set of following demands from, as we see on the right-hand side, a sporting director and manager, maybe agreeing on those KPIs as we see on the left, but also feeding those back to the scouting department so they have a clear overview of exactly what they're looking for. So in this case, we're looking for somebody who's good in front of goal, who's good in build-up play, has an instant impact right now to get us promoted, is eligible to play in the Premier League /EFL. So for that, we'll be looking at GBE points, but also needs to be a leader. And why I've highlighted that in bold is because needs to be a leader is a term we hear quite a lot within scouting, or messages passed down from a head coach or a manager. And that is something that is very hard to really measure in the initial step of the scouting process. So if we go back to the funnel analogy, the really big part of data scouting is pretty difficult. So being able to filter on things like leadership or character is a very difficult stage, which is why we say that data scouting isn't the be all and end all. And that's why we need insight from a wide range of personas within the scouting department. And funnily enough, agents can be a good source for that sort of information as well. So how do we set benchmarks with these incoming tips? That's something that we need to do, and is a really big challenge within data scouting. So everything we have here in terms of good in front of goal, good in build-up play means they need to be a good goal scorer, but they also need to be able to link in possession as well. How do we reflect that in the data? That's really what we're coming to next. So if we're looking at performance KPIs, we're purely looking at things that are happening on the pitch. So we say they need to be good in front of goal. They need to be able to get into good goal scoring positions and be able to link the ball as well. For this, we've used the recruitment application to filter on some of these KPIs. So number 1, 2, and 3 are prioritized there. So when we look at the output that comes, or the input that we put into the search, on the right-hand side, we have close shot, positioning in the box, and direct pass. So all 3 of these things are really important in terms of the language that we've had passed down from the sporting director and manager or head coach. But we've also prioritized this within the search as well. So by top 10%, we mean the top 10% of players in their position and league. So let's say, for example, we're filtering on the top 10% for close shot. Somebody like Erling Haaland would be in there, for example, from the Bundesliga, because he's in the top 10% for finishing in that league, and so on and so forth for top third and top half as well. So it's all about keeping it in relation to the other players in the same league and same position as well, because by then you are filtering down to a more focused search as well. So what do we get from this output? Initially, we get something which is quite refreshing. We get Kylian Mbappe, Robert Lewandowski, and Erling Haaland as our top 3 options, which we would say matches well with this criteria. But of course, how do we find realistic options for this use case? That's something that, as a championship club searching for a new striker to get us promoted, I have no doubt that all three of these strikers could get us promoted to the Premier League. However, they need to be realistic options, and we can use data to do that further. So how can we use the skill level benchmarks? We look back at the Chris Wood example to see that he was a good fit for Newcastle's current squad. He was a good first team player. But we also see here how skill level this championship club wants an instant impact right now. So we can use SciSkill, which provides an indication of the player's current skill level, as well as their potential ability. At the moment, we're purely looking at the SciSkill within this research down below, and we've collected historical data of what's been the average within a league to get promoted, to finish mid-table, and then also for relegation teams as well. We see in the championship highlighted there that on average it takes around 78.8 average SciSkill to be promoted to the Premier League from the championship, but also that there's some other benchmarks as well. So mid-table is 68.9, and we would say, okay, 78.8 is a very exact number, and it's not the case that if a player's SciSkill is 70, for example, that they can't be promoted to the Premier League, which is why we always outline that this is an indication of the player's current skill level and their potential ability. So I think making sure that we have some margin of errors good here and allows us to have a bit more of a flexible search. So for this, on the SciSports input on the right-hand side, we've put the SciSkill level between 70 and 80 and benchmark between 70 and 90 for potential. So by doing this, we're finding somebody who can have a good impact right now, but then also potentially can play in the Premier League as well. So that upper value of 90 allows us to find players who could cut it in the Premier League as well. And of course, the SciSkill and the potential are updated after every match. So there is room for change here as well, which is why it's good to reinforce that benchmarks should be constantly reviewed, and the players that come into those searches as well should be reviewed too. So what players do we get out of this search based on the information we see here, but also the previous criteria we've put into the search as well? Our top three options out of a full criteria of 25 are Adam Armstrong, Sean Weissman, and Milan Pavkov from Star Belgrade. Again, that's quite a refreshing set of top three players to find in the shortlist, or the long list, if you want to say it that way. Adam Armstrong, for example, scored 25 goals or 28 goals, I think, last season in the Championship for Blackburn Rovers before being bought by Southampton. So that's quite a nice example of a player who could move back to an ambitious Championship club. Of course, would Adam Armstrong, from his point of view, want to move back to the Championship whilst he's playing quite frequently for Southampton? That's obviously another matter, and that's why data scouting overall can always leave you with some question marks, but that again requires expert knowledge within the club or from an agent to be able to provide that information as well. And as we see, as I've outlined there were 25 players within the search. So overall, I think there should be some useful options past these three as well that this fictive search should find. So what happens next within the scouting process? We've looked at the initial step of data scouting, but where do we go from here? I think we outlined it previously, but video scouting is obviously very important and can provide quite an efficient way of checking a player and seeing whether the information marries up with what the data is saying on them. But then from there, we can look more into live scouting, background checks on a player, and then by that time, negotiation as well if we've decided what our top searches are. But overall, I think it's quite important to kind of reiterate that it's a very fluid process as well. And of course, the main topic of today's session is how can we validate incoming tips? So what are some of the learning lessons that we have from this search and from setting benchmark KPIs? Well, I think initially data can be used as a good starting point within the process. So like we've seen there, we've done it very efficiently, but it's also very important to get expert knowledge from multiple people within the club. So not only the scouting department second guessing maybe what the manager wants, but also having that alignment and that identity within the club, that the sporting director is on the same page, the manager, the head of recruitment, and the recruitment analysts as well, or the scouts even further. So it's really important to make sure that everybody is on the same page so we can set the KPIs and we can set the benchmarks to be able to look into exactly what we're looking for. So that consistency within the recruitment process is really important, but also we can look at how the recruitment application can set those benchmarks in an easy way. And I hope the webinar today has briefly showed that, but also mainly to answer the question of how we can use benchmarks within the daily process is to keep these benchmarks in mind. So from a data-driven perspective, it's all about making sure we have the right information at our fingertips. So whether that is in the recruitment application or within an external document, it's really important to make sure that we have those benchmarks in mind. So whether it's size, skill, or performance, or physical attributes, or playing style, it can really help narrow down the process overall in terms of going from getting the request in from an agent of this player is available for the club, and then we can sit down and look through the benchmarks and through the players' data to say that he's a good option, or maybe he's not so good an option that the agent has suggested. So overall, I think data can be a really helpful part of the process. I think that's about it in terms of 20 minutes or so for the presentation. I think we'll move on to some questions now. Like I said, you can ask some down in the left-hand side or the right-hand side. So let's move on to some questions if there are any. First question is, what parameters do you use to set the average benchmarks for leagues? So that's a good question. I think in terms of size skill, we're purely looking at, or in terms of skill level, we're purely looking at the size skill of a player. So is the player historically, what has it taken for Bournemouth, West Brom, other teams that have been promoted from the Championship to the Premier League? What does it take in terms of overall to be able to go from there to the Premier League? But also maybe related to the average benchmarks for the leagues in terms of the performance. So say, for example, with close shot, we filtered on the top 10%. I think the parameters for that, by selecting top 10%, that was our number one priority, which is why we selected the highest percentile group. But that can really depend as well. So if you're searching within top leagues for players, I think it's really important to keep the parameters quite wide, because there's obviously more competition and more quality within those leagues, but also as well, how do we look into the lesser leagues, should we say? So if we're a Championship club and we're looking in a second or third division somewhere, maybe we need to be a bit more narrow to filter out the players who maybe don't reach that sort of quality benchmark. So it's a very good question. I think overall it's all about making it as flexible as you can, and having that alignment within the club to say this is exactly the type of player and the type of league that we want to recruit from. Hope that answers your question, by the way. Just a quick one. Will this presentation be available after the webinar? I think that's correct. I think there'll be a recording sent out afterwards to your email box. Another question from Thibaut. Could you also filter on playing style? For example, Luke de Jong needs crosses to be successful, and Vinicius Junior is better at counterplay. That's a good question. And it's a good example as well, actually, of Luke de Jong, because I think, most people are aware of his ability in the air and ability from crosses. Playing style is 100% something you can filter on within the platform, and it's something that I think is very valuable to do. Within our search, we didn't have the demands for a typical number 9 or a pressing forward or anything like that, but doing that in certain positions can definitely be very useful. So I would make sure to do that as well, if it's relevant to your search, of course. A good question here. How does what division a player plays in impact the SciSports view of a player? And how would you define what achievement is more impressive? For example, 10 goals in the Championship versus the Scottish Premier League versus the Belgian First Division. Again, a very good question and a very valid one as well. I think from a data perspective, size, skill, and potential are most impacted by the strength of a league, so to say. So we've done quite extensive research on what we would deem as a strong league or a weak league. So from that perspective, the intuition of the size skill has some elements of that. But also when we look at the pure performance of a player, we're only benchmarking them to their current league and players within that league. So a striker scoring 10 goals in the Championship is benchmarked against other strikers in the Championship. And the same goes for the Scottish Premiership and the Belgian First Division as well. How you then calculate the difference between the leagues is up to you, really. I think there is plenty of research you could do with that, and how you determine the success of a player in the Championship versus Belgium, for example. We're doing research on that recently at SciSports, which I think is quite interesting. But it can come down to a few things. So looking at successful transfers that have maybe come from certain leagues, but I think a good thing with that is there are some leagues where there haven't been too many players come from those divisions. For example, Czech Republic, Souček and Koufal came to West Ham from there directly, and they've both played very well. However, there's not a huge sample size of players coming from that league to the Premier League. So for that, I would say is good to be careful in that type of research as well. Hope that answers your question. Good question from Vinay. Do you also provide benchmarks for selling clubs to help them decide on retaining players? Not directly. I think that use case can definitely be done. So, for example, players are looking, or clubs are always looking at their current squad, how much depth they have, and who they need to retain. Like you say, what you can do for that is use the recruitment application to look into the performance of a player to see whether he reaches the sort of benchmarks that you're looking for, and that's something that we definitely train clubs to do in the right way. However, it's also dependent on what you have in the building. So let's say, for example, you have a left back who maybe hasn't been performing so well, but there's no other left back at the club, or a left back on your radar that you want to sign, then it kind of wouldn't make sense to sell somebody if they're your only player in that position. So for that, and that's something we do at SciSports, is looking into the squad depth as well. So planning for future windows, future planning is very important for that. And obviously retaining players comes under that umbrella. Thank you for that question. It was a nice one. Yeah, good question from Giovanni, related to wanting to find a player who's a leader. Says obviously there's no data for that. Would you say this is the biggest problem of relying on data-only recruitment? Short answer is yes. Long answer is I don't think data-only recruitment is really a thing overall. So, like you say, that sort of information can't be picked up in the data. So SciSports, we're positioned hopefully at the start of the scouting process, and should be a place where a scouting or looking for a player is started, but that's not by no means the end goal. So we're always looking for the next step of the process. The club will then go to video or to live scouting, like I've outlined, because of course there are blind spots in data. So not only things like leadership and character, but cultural influences as well. So does the player want to move to the country? Does he fit into the type of culture that we're playing in? Those are all other things as well. So that's where the role of the head of recruitment and the sporting director and a whole host of other people within the club are very important. Well, I think we've got time just for one more question. How large is the data set when judging a player? That's a good question. So when looking at performance, we benchmark players against others who have at least 450 minutes in that season. That's sort of a good benchmark we set, but we always supply a warning note as well on the performance of a player if they've played less than 450 minutes or less than 900 as well. So the insights for a player will show after 450, and they'll only be benchmarked against players who have the same level of minutes. And for that, we, in every benchmark, is on a per 90 basis as well. So somebody who's played 2,000 minutes versus 1,200 isn't going to be having an advantage in that respect. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. So thanks for your questions. They're very insightful and very useful. I think hopefully you got something from this webinar. Yeah, stay tuned on our socials as well for upcoming webinars in the following months, and have a nice day.